Hi, this is Jeremy Jansen, and I'd like to welcome you to the June 2011 issue of Reason Wizardry. Last month we looked at mastering techniques in Reason, and this month I was originally planning on continuing on with that and showing you some advanced mastering combinators. That's going to wait for another month due to a variety of reasons. Instead, we're going to take another look at the Kong drum designer. So Kong has been out for just about a year now with Reason 5, and we had an initial look at it with the Reason 5 issue in August 2010. The first thing that you should do, if you haven't already seen that issue, is have a look at it because the complete issue is free on YouTube. So for that issue, basically we only had a quick overview of Kong and then went into some of its limitations as far as CV inputs and how to work around those. This time we're going to look at some very different topics, including sequencing using Kong and other devices, and stereo Kong drum hits, as well as a wide range of other varied topics. So there are three different ways that we can use Kong as well as another Reason device for sequencing. And the first one is redrum. I've showed something similar to this same technique when using redrum to control Thor drum patches. And it's very similar to that. So we basically just add a redrum, flip the rack around, and we use the gate output from each one of the redrum channels connecting to the gate input of the corresponding Kong channel. So for this patch, we're just going to map the first four. But you can see right now we're going to run into an issue with larger Kong patches because of course there are only 10 channels in redrum and there are 16 channels in Kong. So if you did want to sequence 16 or more than 10 channels in Kong, you'd have to use a second redrum and you'd have to use a different pattern and you'd have to use one pattern in each redrum. So that would increase its complexity, but it still wouldn't be too bad. So let's flip this back around here and listen to what we've got. I've got a bass drum in drum 1, a snare drum in drum 2, tom in drum 3, hi-hat in drum 4. So now we can trigger all of those devices using the redrum triggers, as well as create patterns for them. Okay, not the most inspired there, but you get the picture. The other big advantage to using redrum over the other techniques we're going to discuss is that you can create 64-step patterns using redrum. Of course, you have to edit them in 16 steps each, but still you can create long patterns. And that's very handy. And the main reason to use redrum for this is just that it's very simple, easy to use. You can draw in steps and you don't have to mess around too much with different dynamics levels. It's just all there right in front of you, very simple. So the second technique for sequencing Kong is to use multiple matrix devices. So we're going to add 2 matrix devices here. And of course, if you want to sequence all 16 Kong pads, you'll need 16 matrix devices. We'll just use 2, one for the bass drum and one for the snare. And we'll take its gate CV output and put that into the first input on Kong, and then the next gate out into the second input in Kong. Okay, maybe a little bit better second effort there. So the advantages of this technique is that you can change your velocity to exactly what you want with this fine control. And additionally, you can set the number of steps in each pattern. So you could have 32 steps in your bass drum pattern and then only 16 in your snare drum pattern. And if you use uneven multiples, you can create polyrhythms. Let's just give that a try. This is going to sound fairly crazy, probably. Okay, so you get the idea there. And finally, the last advantage is that we can use the curve CV outputs to modify the sound of our Kong devices somehow. So I kind of discussed in that August issue the limitations that there are with setting up and modulating the different Kong instruments. And the problem is that very few of the rotaries are mappable in a combinator. The one rotary in each drum module that is called the DM variable rotary, and by mousing over the different controls, you'll find out which one of the controls is the DM variable. In this case, it's tone. For our snare drum, it is decay. No, sorry, I got that wrong. It's noise decay. So when we flip around Kong, you don't see any of those DM variables here. The only CV modulations available are volume, pitch, and the mod wheel. So we have to use combinator modulations to get at it, and we need to use the new CV inputs to get at it. So what we're going to do is take the curve CV and send that in to our first combinator CV input, and then to our second, turn them up to full, and then we'll add these in Kong. We've actually got one added already, CV input 1, going to drum 1 DM variable, and with a full range. So we'll add the second one, CV input 2, going to drum 2 DM variable at full range. So now we can use the curve to change the noise decay on the snare drum and the tone on the bass drum. So first let's get in the bass drum here and hear what it sounds like. So you can see it changing right there. Okay, now for our snare drum. So we have that much more fine control over our sequences using the matrix devices. Okay, now the final method to sequencing Kong is using Thor step sequencers, and I'll show you that now. So let's add a Thor, and let's flip the rack around and take the step sequencer CV output gate and send that to gate input 1. And I'm just going to do one Thor here for simplicity's sake. So you'll be able to hear we can just add our gate inputs right here. Something like that. And the problem with a Thor, of course, is that you're going to, like the Matrix, need one each for each drum pad you want to sequence. And unlike the Matrix, which takes up a fairly reasonable amount of space, the Thor, in order to program it, needs to be opened. So you'll need 16 Thors open, which can be kind of overwhelming from a screen real estate point of view. Of course, with a Thor, you can also use the different curve parameters to change some of the Kong sound design parameters, but really the main reason I think to use it this way is because you can trigger the Thor step sequencer from a MIDI note. And we'll do that now. MIDI key gate, going to step sequencer trigger. So now anytime I push a MIDI note, the sequence will start, and when I let off the MIDI note, it will end. So that's pretty cool all on its own, but imagine if you restricted the Thor key range to a single note, and then you used multiple Thors all mapped to single notes. You could actually play one key, get a sequence, let go, and then play another key and get a totally separate sequence. So you could have multiple patterns all mapped to whichever keys you'd like on the keyboard. That's really cool, and you can pretty much only do that using Thor. Of course, the downside to that would be that, let's say we wanted to create a sequence using 4 different elements like this. So we'd need 4 Thors for that, which we would map all to one key. And now for a second pattern, we'd need 4 more Thors all mapped to that key. So say we wanted 8 different patterns, we'd need 4 times 8 is 32 Thor devices. So it can get pretty excessive if you want to use a whole bunch of different patterns like this. But if you just wanted 1 or 2 and you don't need too many different kit elements in that pattern, it's pretty simple and straightforward, and it works great for live performance. In addition to the really great sampling features and loop features in Kong with the NN Nano and the Nurse Rex, there's some really excellent synthetic drums inside as well. I haven't gone through them all in detail yet, and I'm not going to in this issue either, because they're quite straightforward controls. The physical drums have a few more rotaries that perhaps don't make sense initially, but just checking the manual for the most part will get you started and in good shape with the synthetic drum modules in Kong. So instead, what I want to show you is how to make these synthetic drum modules very quickly and easily sound better. So I have a few loaded up right here. I've got the bass drum, snare, tom, and hi-hat. And as you can hear with this snare, it's fairly decent quality for a synthetic snare, but it's mono. And what if you want a stereo snare drum? There's many different ways to do it, but the simplest is very easy and very powerful, and that's what I'm going to show you. So to start out, I'm going to create a snare drum that sounds a little bit closer to what I want. So I'm going to lower the pitch a bit. Okay, something like that. Okay, and now I'm going to right-click on the drum pad, copy drum patch, and I'm going to copy it into the drum 6 slot. So those are identical. And now what I'm going to do is hard pan left and right these two patches. Okay, and all we need to do in order to create a stereo snare drum is now to link these patches using the link groups in Kong. We're going to use link group D, and there we are. We can turn down the level a little bit because obviously using two drum sounds where there's only one before is going to have brought the level up. So let's just turn these down. Maybe even a little bit more. So that's a nice stereo snare drum. And just to go into more detail of how that's working, this isn't exactly like, say, the unison modes. If you'd want to create unison with two subtractor patches, then you'd create two or more and then detune each one and pan them against each other. In this case, there's no need to use detune. And normally when you'd play two identical non-detuned sounds, you'd get phasing problems. But that's not an issue here, and that's because of the hit type. You can see there's two hit types. One is no variations, and one is synth snare. And in synth snare mode, every hit is slightly different. So if each of these is slightly different, they won't play exactly the same sound ever. So you can have identical parameters on each drum, but they will still sound slightly different enough to give some stereo depth to the sound when you hard pan these identical patches. Of course, you could slightly change the drum module settings and you'd get perhaps more of a richer and complex stereo sound. I'll just make a few changes here. So it's up to you if you'd like to change a little bit more of the settings in order to get a richer stereo sound. But just by straight hard panning two identical sounds, I think it sounds great. All right, now we're going to move on to creating a stereo version of another sound here. It's the physically modeled tom, and we'll stick with the basic patch I've got loaded here. We'll copy it and paste it and hard pan it and add it to link group E. Turn down its level. And there you are, a really nice stereo tom. Of course, you can, again, make some small changes to it. I'd advise against changing the tuning too much between the two drums. You probably want to change the other parameters to get an in-tune sound. All right, I've got one more device here, and it's the hi-hat. And I want to make one mention quickly of the hit type parameter on the hi-hat drum module in particular. It's not so straightforward how it works. And you have 4 different hit types. And as I go through them, you can hear how the sound changes, and that's without changing any of the parameters here. So remember this when you're using the hi-hat drum module. because the decay setting of, say, 52 on the closed hit type is obviously very different and longer on the open hit type. So even with all the parameters identical, you're going to get a different sound for every rotary depending on what hit type you're in. So it's really like 4 different modules in one. So for this sound, I want to make something that's actually not so much like a hi-hat and maybe more like a crash cymbal. So let's start out here by making some changes. Now we'll stick with that default pitch, a little bit more decay, a little bit more click. Okay, that's not bad, but I wouldn't say that's a really great crash. Now let's do something a little bit different and actually add in another complementary sound. And it's not found in the drum modules, it's actually found in the effects, and that's the noise parameter. Sorry, the noise effects. It's actually a noise generator all by itself without having any drum module in front of it. So let's find some appropriate Okay, that's not bad. So now we have these 2 sounds. Let's link them in the same way we're linking up these stereo drum sounds. The noise is a little bit loud here. Let's turn that down. Okay, it's not amazing. I'd probably tweak that a little bit more for perfection. But now let's move on and actually make this a stereo sound, which is going to really improve, especially a crash sound that's really not meant to be mono. So what we're going to do is copy this drum patch from the hi-hat to drum 12, and then copy the noise from drum 8 to drum 16. All right, now all we need to do is hard pan these. So now we're finished. All we need to do is link these up with group F. The noise is probably a little bit loud. Let's lower that down to 64 on each. And you're noticing that the left side is probably more different than you'd expect. And that's because when you copy a drum module, as you can see here, its hit type isn't preserved. So we need to go in here and change it to open. So there's our stereo crash using Kong and 2 different devices. The final thing to consider with these techniques is, of course, you only have 3 link groups. So that means you can only do 3 different stereo groups in a single Kong. So we've got the snare drum, the tom, and the crash. So if you wanted to do more stereo link groups, you would need to use multiple Kong drum designer devices. Now we are going to have a closer look at the NN Nano. And we're going to look specifically at one of its unique parameters, and it's the sample start. And we've looked at sample start before in the relation to the NN19 and its capability to almost do a pseudo granular type sampling. This time we're going to look at something more simple and possible using the NN Nano because it has a greater range of sample start. Unfortunately, on the NN19, even if you turn the sample start to the very end, that doesn't encompass that much of the sample's range. Here in the NN Nano, it seems like you're able to navigate farther into the sample using a sample start. So the first thing we're going to do is listen to this sample start parameter and what kind of different sounds we can make using it. First, by listening to this simple cymbal crash. So let's just navigate through a little bit here. So we can get a pretty interesting sound if we get rid of almost all of the attack. And let's raise the volume a bit using this compressor here. And now let's lower the pitch of this sample. And maybe add a little bit of velocity to sample start. That keeps the sound from being exactly the same with every hit. Of course, there's many ways to overcome that, but this is a simple way. Every different velocity value will start the sample at a slightly different spot. So there's almost a little bit of a gong type sound from a very high original cymbal crash. Okay, now let's move on and take a sample that isn't percussion-like at all and see what we can come up with as a percussion sound with it. So all I need to do is change the hit type and we'll switch over to this breath wash sample, which is from the factory sound bank in the FX and voices folder in the other samples folder, I believe. So let's listen to what it sounds like. All right, now let's step through it a little bit with sample start. Let's remove that velocity to level modulation for right now. There's some interesting sound, almost percussion-like with a reverb at the end of this sample. So let's add some sample start modulation with velocity. That sounds pretty good, but it's almost the reverse of what we want because it's loud at low velocity and quiet at high velocity. So let's do kind of the reverse. Let's raise up the sample start to about 49,000, and we'll do reverse sample start modulation of about 13. And now add a little bit of level modulation with velocity. And let's shorten the decay for a little bit more of a punchy sound. raise the volume a bit. And let's try a transient shaper to accentuate, once again, the punchiness of the sample. So we've got a fairly unique and interesting percussion sample out of the very end of this breath wash effects sample. The nice thing about this technique of navigating using sample start through a sample and finding interesting percussion sounds is that it's very unlikely that others have found the exact same sound that you've found. So even in something as frankly overplayed sometimes, as overplayed and overused sometimes as the factory library can be, you can use some of those samples and find some sounds inside them that probably nobody else has found yet. Certainly a sound like that wouldn't directly associate with the original breath wash sample that it came from. With the NNXT, you've always been able to load up Rex or Rex2 files and then pick out individual hits and use those as your own drum hits. You can also do that in redrum. But I particularly like some of the additional features towards that goal with the Nurse Rex module, and I'll show you how that works right now. So I've loaded up a loop here from the factory library, and I'm just going to play it back in loop trigger mode. Okay, so it's just a basic, almost a fill, snare heavy drum loop. So what if we like the snare in there? Well, it's very easy to pull one out using the slice trigger mode. But we can also pull out more than one snare and do interesting things with them here. So first let's find our initial snare. So we need to turn on the trigger for whichever part of the loop we're looking to take out. So let's try this. That's a snare. We'll use that. And now, no, how about this one? So what is happening here is if we select more than one slice, it's going to randomly, I believe, or perhaps it's sequentially, go through every one of the samples that we've selected. So if we select a variety of snare samples from a single loop, it'll go through all of them when playing a single pad. And if you use that as your snare drum, all of a sudden you can have a very humanized snare feel if you put that in with your pattern. So let's find another snare sound here. Is this a snare? Well, it's a snare and a kick, so I'm not sure about that. Okay, well, that's 3 anyways in this sample. So obviously a loop with more hits in it, say you wanted to extract a kick drum, it's great to have more hits in it because you're going to have more choices to pull out. And also in a drum loop, often hits overlap. So you'll have a kick drum with a hi-hat over top of it, and we probably want to just isolate that kick drum. So by choosing a loop that's very long with many hits in it, you're going to have more chance of pulling out all those different hits. Okay, let's load up another Nurse Rex, and we'll do something similar, but not with a pure drum loop, more with a percussion loop. So we'll go in here and let's see what we can find. Well, in this case, we've got a darbuka loop, and there's nothing, well, I don't understand darbuka theory, but it's not split up obviously into, kick, snare, hi-hat type thing. So in this case, what I like to do is just take some random hits and assign them to triggers. Try that. And set it to slice trigger mode. Let's add some additional volume here. For some reason, it's quite quiet. So once you have something like this, I don't know what I have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Maybe we'll throw in one more here. Once you have that, you can just play that back to whatever rhythm you like, and you can get some kind of natural humanized loop behind it. So you just add your own timing, and just by playing one single pad, you can get sort of your own variation on the darbuka loop that you started with. And it'll be completely different depending on what slices you decided to trigger. You can enhance this same technique by using a second Nurse Rex, loading up another loop, here as I'll show you, and continuing on. So let's take a different, let's try one of these and set that to slice trigger and let's select some of the longer slices in here. There we go. And so now, let's raise the volume on this one as well. Some of these actually have more than one hit, it seems like. So probably best not to use those. I think I've got it edited fairly well now. Okay, so now let's assign these two Nurse Rex to an alternate group. Now, so it's going to go back and forth between those two groups, and they're playing random slices. So that way you can get a really unique result of kind of like a hybrid version of multiple different loops. Now, you could continue on with this. Say take 4 different darbuka loops and put them in these 4. Assign different triggers to all of them, and then assign them all to the same alternate group. And you'd get something that never would sound exactly the same way. And depending on the rhythm and timing you'd play back with, would be something very easy to play. Remember, it's just one note, but would sound very humanized and natural. All right, so I've got one more section on Kong for you here, and it also uses the Dr. Octorex, and what it's about is drum replacement. So what if you listen to a drum loop and there's one aspect of it that you don't like that much and you'd like to replace it with something else, and maybe a synth drum from the Kong drum designer? So we're going to tackle that problem, and to start out with, we're going to listen to this loop from the factory library. Okay, so we want to replace the kick on that, let's say. So I've already done most of the work here. It's a little bit different than what we did so far in that I'm going to just explain the work that I've done. So what we need to do here, for every slice that is a kick, we determine is the kick, I should say, we need to change its output to 1, 2. And what that's going to do is allow us to use a different slice output for that kick. And then we're going to send that signal into a compressor and a Thor, which are actually functioning as an envelope follower. So when they receive that audio signal from just the kick, because we've isolated it using the slice outputs, they'll then output a CV signal, which will enter into our Kong and create a Kong sound that's going to happen exactly at the right time to replace that kick. So I've already done that for all the kick sounds in this loop. Let's listen to what it sounds with all the kicks essentially muted. And now I'll unmute this Kong and we'll hear the new Kong kick track. So you can see here I've got the bass drum module playing what you hear right now. So I'll explain how the envelope follower works. We've got this slice outputs being sent to the audio input of the compressor, and then in terms of audio, it's a dead end because we don't use that. But we do use the gain reduction CV. And we send that gain reduction CV into the Thor in CV1. Let's open up the programmer and you'll see what else is going on. CV1 is being sent to the global envelope gate. And we have a very, very short gate signal here. 10 millisecond decay and release, everything else at 0. That global envelope is being sent through CV output 1. And CV output 1 is connected to the gate input of the Kong. And you might ask what this final scaler is. Well, it's going to get much louder when I turn it down, so I have to play with this level first here. Essentially what we're doing is scaling this amount of envelope being sent by the level of CV being sent from the compressor. So what this is doing is it's acting as essentially a velocity doubler, taking the relative level that's coming in from the original kick and copying it onto the new kick. So that's why we need this turned up. So now let's get that level back to normal. Okay, so I'm going to demonstrate this with one more loop, and we're going to remove the kick and replace it with an NN nano kick. And first let's hear the original loop. And now once I've gone in and changed all the kick slices to output 1, 2, Now let's turn on the Kong. So it's set up and working exactly the same way as our previous envelope follower. And you could use this for any part of the loop that you can isolate. So if you'd like to change the snare to something in Kong, you could do it the exact same way. For the envelope follower itself and the compressor part, the values that I've used are more by feel than science. I think I've talked about this more in an envelope follower issue. So sometimes depending on the loop you use, you'll need slight adjustment, typically of the threshold and the release. So be aware of that. If you're getting double hits perhaps, or you're missing a hit, play with those two parameters and you'll probably find something that fits and gives you the right envelope follower effect. We've now reached the end of the June 2011 issue of Reason Wizardry. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed all the new Kong tricks in this issue. I'll be back next month with a brand new bag of tricks. Until next time, I'm Jeremy Jansen. Cheers.